Recently, I got a relatively simple question in my comments that I would like to answer in today's video. The question was, where should a support currently start? When does it make sense to start in middle lane? And when does it make sense to start in duo lane? For the purpose of this video, we'll call this duo lane. If you don't start in duo lane, it basically is just long lane, but you get the idea. There are a couple of factors that come in here. First of all, what kind of ADC do you have? What kind of mid laner do you have? And what kind of jungler do you have? Also, does the jungler want to start in middle lane? We're now going to basically rule out scenarios where you don't want to start in mid. First scenario is your jungler starts in middle lane. If your jungler starts in middle lane, they will get middle pressure between the jungler and the mid laner, and they will want the XP from the mid wave, not triple split in most scenarios. So it makes more sense for you to start in duo, because otherwise you're just gonna put your team behind unnecessarily, unless you feel like both your jungler and mid laner have very weak lane pressure and somehow you think that you as a support can change that. This is definitely something that has to be communicated, but in most cases, when the jungler starts in middle, just don't go there. And that's something you have to check with the jungler. Most junglers will still decide between starting in solo and starting in middle. It's not necessarily a set rule now where people start. Some even still start at jungle camps. So I would say go with whatever your jungler says, but ask them first. The second point after that is checking with your ADC. Your ADC may be somebody who can clear lane on their own, if it's for example an Anhur, who should not be struggling with solo clearing the wave even from early points of the game. The problem is the mindset that comes into play here and the mental factor. If your ADC, your hunter, expects you to help them in the beginning because they're used to it, because they want to invade buff camp, specifically smalls, to get extra XP, or anything of that sort, then you should probably help them. Even if you believe that gameplay-wise it would make more sense for you to start middle lane, you should probably still start in duo. The impact on the ADC, if he gets pissed off by you not helping him and maybe just throwing the game intentionally afterwards, or maybe struggling too much and then blaming you and getting upset and wasting time typing shit, is just way worse than anything that could happen to your mid laner who does not necessarily expect you to be there. You may be able to get a buff camp off that, you may be able to get a red buff off you being in middle lane, but if in return you have a tilted ADC, you're probably gonna have more problems with that than you have advantages out of that extra damage on your mid laner. So, in this scenario that everything is communicated, you've talked to your jungler, you've talked to your mid laner, and you've talked to your ADC, and your ADC thinks it's okay that you start in middle, will be able to hold his lane on his own and will not be upset with you, then you can consider starting in middle. Then it's still a question of if your mid laner really needs it. If it's a very aggressive mid laner against an enemy mid laner that is already relatively weak, and you as a support are not like the strongest clearing support, for example, it could make sense. Say, you have Isis, you are Gap, and the enemy is a Poseidon. Now the Isis will outclear the Poseidon early on, but the Isis on her own can probably not go and invade a buff camp. But if you as Gap, even though your clear is relatively weak, will be able to follow her to that buff camp, you can basically save her from any potential aggression, and that way you can get a huge lane lead, especially against someone with a Poseidon when your Isis then had a red buff. Likewise, if your middle laner is a Sean Kui and you are a Ymir, you can also help him greatly because Sean Kui on his own will struggle early on, and with the Ymir who has high early damage, high aggression, you can make up for that as long as you get anything out of that. You should not just hang around a middle lane and leech the waves, because that's probably the worst thing that could happen in terms of impact, because your ADC will be put in a worse spot, whereas you are not getting enough benefit out of your different positioning to make up for it. I would say it's even worth considering going for a mid lane start when you don't intend to invade, if all the enemy characters are stronger than yours in the early game, and you feel like you're gonna fall behind, but it would help you not getting invaded and at least securing your own buffs. So that purpose is there as well. Generally speaking, I do think there are opportunities to start in middle, but it's very, very important that those opportunities are talked through with your team, that they are communicated, and that they benefit everyone. For example, there are scenarios where even when all this applies, it can still not benefit your team if both you and your mid laner end up buying Bamba's Mask. Shouldn't hopefully happen all too often after this patch. We see Bamba's Mask generally shifting more towards the supports instead of the mid laners, but it can happen, and when it happens, then you would basically take away extra healing, extra farm from each other by being together, and that would probably be a worst case scenario. It's always worth keeping in mind that you can have more than enough of an impact by starting in duo lane and just invading the smalls and getting that little level spike and then rotating into mid relatively early if you want to. Mostly that will even be possible closely after the first few levels, so it should not be a major issue. The advantage out of starting in middle will always be that the mid waves clash a little earlier, so you're able to invade somewhere earlier because you clear the wave a little earlier, and that is something that should not be underestimated, but I feel like in most scenarios you still want to help out your ADC. If not for anything else, then for the fact that most of them are still in the mindset of their support helping them and getting really bothered if that doesn't happen. I hope that clears up any question about this topic. Thank you guys for watching. I hope this was insightful. I hope this was helpful. If you liked this video, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell down below. See you for the next one tomorrow. Duke Sloth, out.